Welcome back to the SCS Sentinel of the Stars. I'll be your captain. We're here above Mars Hall in the Andromeda sector. However, the planet has sadly fallen to the automatons. Before we can begin, we're going to move the ship over into orbit over Charon Prime. Once we're done here, we'll join the fight on Martyr Bay, potentially. In the meantime, we're getting up to speed on Congress and along the way gaining a deeper understanding of how the American government works. They don't have the benefits of managed democracy, and if they're not careful, we're going to find out how they lost regular democracy. Welcome to Defender 78.
FTL jump
You all set?
successful.
Yes, Captain. Heading to my help pod now. The data is being uploaded to my HUD. It's a shame about Martell, sir. I know it's where you were stationed before the war. We'll get him next time.
Hellpod launch initiated.
If the automatons can feel regret, they shall feel it soon.
I'm on the ground, Captain, and ready to resume the special mission. I don't know what the hell real Earth is, but according to the reports you've been sharing, their Ministry of Defense really sucks. That Pete Hegseth guy is the worst. Anyway, let's continue with the second meeting of the Continental Congress. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened at the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, on May 10th, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord had already occurred.
Hold on a sec, Helldiver. When we left off, the revolution hadn't started officially. Perhaps we should go over how the conflict ignited.
You are absolutely right, Captain.
Tagging map.
The leap from a coordinated economic boycott in October 1774 to an active shooting war in April 1775 is the most critical escalation of the era. The delegates did not simply go home and wait. The continent actively militarized during that 6-month window. Here is the detailed breakdown of the exact sequence of events that pushed the colonies past the point of no return. 1. The enforcement of the boycott, winter 1774 to 1775. When the First Continental Congress dissolved, its primary legacy was the Continental Association, a sweeping economic boycott of British goods. However, a boycott only works if it is enforced. To ensure compliance, Congress authorized the creation of local committees of inspection in every town and county. These committees, comprised of local patriots, effectively became shadow governments. They inspected merchants' ledgers, published the names of violators, tarring and feathering some, and actively suppressed loyalist dissent. By early 1775, royal authority had collapsed in the countryside of almost every colony. Real power rested with these extra-legal committees. 2. The Powder Alarms and the Provincial Congress, late 1774. In Massachusetts, the royal governor and commander of British forces in North America, General Thomas Gage, realized he was rapidly losing control outside of Boston. The Powder Alarm, September 1st, 1774. Gage secretly sent a detachment of British regulars to seize a provincial gunpowder magazine in Somerville, Massachusetts. The operation was successful, but a rumor rapidly spread across the countryside that the British had fired on civilians. Within 24 hours, an estimated 4,000 armed militiamen marched on Cambridge. While no blood was shed, this event terrified Gage and proved that the colonials were ready to fight. The militarization of New England. In response to Gage's actions, the Massachusetts Patriots formed the Provincial Congress, an illegal government, in October 1774. This body officially directed town militias to purge loyalist officers, stockpile weapons, and organize elite, rapid response companies that would become known as Minutemen. 3. The Imperial Response, no compromise, early 1775. While the colonies were arming, the British government in London was digging in. King George III's Declaration, November 1774. The king wrote to his prime minister, Lord North, stating unequivocally, the New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. The New England Restraining Act, spring 1775. Parliament retaliated against the Continental Association by passing an act that banned New England colonies from trading with any nation other than Britain, and crucially, barred them from fishing in the North Atlantic, threatening the region's primary food and economic source. The Dartmouth Orders, January 27, 1775. Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, sent secret orders to General Gage. He ordered Gage to stop tolerating the shadow governments, to arrest the principal leaders of the rebellion, like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and to seize their weapons caches by force, even if it meant sparking a conflict. 4. Virginia joins the brinksmanship, March 1775. The militarization was not confined to New England. On March 23, 1775, the Second Virginia Convention met at St. John's Church in Richmond. Recognizing that war was inevitable, Patrick Henry introduced a resolution to put the colony of Virginia into a state of defense and organize a cavalry and infantry militia. To push the reluctant, moderate planters into voting for the measure, Henry delivered his legendary "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. The resolution passed narrowly. Virginia, the wealthiest and most populous colony, was now officially arming itself against the crown. 5. The Spark, Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775. General Gage finally received Dartmouth orders in April. Knowing he lacked the manpower to arrest Adams and Hancock, who were constantly moving, he decided to strike at the Patriot Supply Depot in the town of Concord, about 20 miles inland from Boston. The march, on the night of April 18th, Gage sent 700 elite British light infantry and grenadiers across the Charles River. Patriot intelligence immediately detected the movement, prompting Paul Revere and William Dawes to ride into the countryside to sound the alarm. Lexington Green. At dawn on April 19th, the British vanguard reached the town of Lexington and found about 70 militiamen standing on the town green, commanded by Captain John Parker. The British major ordered the rebels to drop their weapons and disperse. As the militia began to back away, a shot rang out. It is historically unknown who fired it, but the British troops immediately unleashed a volley into the militia, killing 8 Americans and wounding 10. The bridge at Concord and the retreat. The British column marched onto Concord, where they destroyed some supplies. However, by mid-morning, thousands of militiamen had converged on the town. At the North Bridge in Concord, the American militia fired on British regulars for the first time, inflicting casualties and forcing a retreat. The slaughter, the 16-mile march back to Boston, became a brutal, running guerrilla battle. American militiamen fired from behind trees, stone walls, and houses, inflicting horrific casualties on the retreating British column. By nightfall, the British were trapped in Boston, and a siege army of 15,000 furious New Englanders surrounded the city. 3 weeks later, on May 10, 1775, the delegates rode into Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. They no longer had the luxury of debating constitutional theory. They had an active war on their hands. Primary and secondary sourcing for this outline. Primary documents. The Journals of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts in 1774 and 1775. General Thomas Gage's correspondence with Lord Dartmouth, UK National Archives. Deposition of Captain John Parker regarding the events at Lexington. Historiography. Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher. The definitive, highly detailed military history of the powder alarms and April 19th, the first American Revolution. Before Lexington and Concord by Ray Raphael. for the collapse of royal authority via the Committees of Inspection in late 1774, the glorious cause by Robert Middlecoff. So, essentially, the Congress abruptly transitioned from a protest group into a provisional wartime government. Building a military and infrastructure, 1775. The Continental Army, June 14, 1775 Congress adopted the New England militia forces surrounding Boston, officially creating the Continental Army. The next day, they unanimously elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief, a political masterstroke that tied the wealthy, populous colony of Virginia to the New England conflict. Declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms, July 6, 1775. Co-authored by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson, this document justified the armed resistance, stating the colonies were resolved to die freemen rather than to live slaves, though it still formally denied a desire for total independence. The Olive Branch Petition, July 8, 1775. Driven by moderates like Dickinson, this was a final appeal to King George III to intervene and stop Parliament's aggressive actions. The king refused to even receive it, and by August, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion, declaring the colonies in open mutiny. Administrative foundations. Congress established a post office, naming Benjamin Franklin Postmaster General, a Navy, and a Marine Corps, and began the authorization of privateers.
It appears the colonies were not all in agreement about even the details of revolution. If they didn't have an accord, what central body controlled the military? Did New England speak for all colonies?
You have hit on the exact paranoia that nearly tore the colonies apart before the ink on the Declaration was even dry, Captain. To answer your questions directly, no central body had absolute, unquestioned control over the military, and New England absolutely did not speak for the rest of the colonies. In fact, New England's radicalism was viewed as a massive threat by the other regions. Here is how the Continental Congress desperately tried to manage a war while navigating deep, bitter regional divisions. The military command structure, a two-tiered mess. When the Second Continental Congress adopted the army outside Boston in June 1775, they became the de facto central authority. However, they possessed no constitutional right to compel anyone to do anything. They managed the military through a fragile, two-tiered system. 1. The Continental Army, the national force. This was the professional, standing army. Civilian supremacy. Congress was terrified of a standing military dictatorship, a fear inherited from Oliver Cromwell's England. Therefore, George Washington answered directly to the civilian Continental Congress. Congress dictated his strategy, promoted his generals, often based on political quotas rather than merit, and held the purse strings. The Board of War. By June 1776, Congress realized managing an army via the entire legislative body was impossible. They created the Board of War and Ordnance, initially headed by John Adams, to handle the crushing logistics of raising troops, securing weapons, and managing prisoners. The flaw: Congress could authorize troop levels, but they had no power to actually draft soldiers or tax citizens to pay them. They had to rely on a requisition system, begging the individual state legislatures to send their assigned quotas of men and money. The states routinely failed to do so. 2. The state militias, the local forces, running parallel to the Continental Army were the state militias. State control. These men answered solely to their respective provincial congresses and state governors, not to George Washington or the Continental Congress. The friction. Militiamen were notorious for signing up for short enlistments, often 90 days, refusing to march across state lines, and fleeing under fire. Washington despised the militia system, constantly begging Congress for a professional, long-term standing army. However, state politicians loved their militias because they kept military power localized and decentralized.
Is this where the concept of the U.S. National Guard stemmed from?
You have connected the exact historical dots, Captain. Yes, the modern United States National Guard is the direct, legal, and institutional descendant of those decentralized colonial and state militias you identified. The friction between George Washington's desire for a professional standing army and the state politicians' desire for localized, decentralized military power did not end with the Revolutionary War. It became a foundational argument during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and eventually led to the creation of the National Guard as we know it today. Here is the deep dive into exactly how those unreliable revolutionary militias evolved into the modern National Guard. 1. The Constitutional Compromise, 1787. Following the war, the Founding Fathers had to decide how to defend the new nation. The Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, still wanted a strong, central, standing army. The Anti-Federalists, representing the states' rights perspective, were terrified of a standing army, viewing it as a tool for tyranny, and insisted on relying on the state militias. They reached a compromise in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15 and 16. This established a dual control system that still exists today. Federal power. Congress was granted the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Congress could also establish the rules for organizing, arming, and disciplining them. State power. The states explicitly retain the authority to appoint the officers of their militias and to conduct their actual training, according to the rules set by Congress. 2. The Militia Act of 1792, the Universal Militia. Shortly after the Constitution was ratified, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1792 to clarify how these state forces would operate. The mandate. It legally required every free, able-bodied white male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45 to enroll in their local state militia. The flaw. Just like in the Revolutionary War, the federal government did not fund them. Militiamen were required to provide their own musket, bayonet, knapsack, and ammunition. Because there was no federal funding or standard enforcement, the militias remained highly localized, poorly trained, and wildly inconsistent from state to state throughout the 19th century, just as Washington had complained they were in 1775. 3. The origin of the name National Guard, 1824. The term National Guard was not an official U.S. government designation at first. It was a spontaneous homage to a foreign ally. The Lafayette visit. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolution, returned to the United States for a massive tour. The tribute. To honor him, the 2nd Battalion, 11th New York Artillery, a prominent New York militia unit, decided to rename themselves the Battalion of National Guards. They chose this name because Lafayette had commanded the Garde Nationale, National Guard, in Paris during the early days of the French Revolution. The name sounded prestigious, and over the next few decades, other state militia units voluntarily adopted the title National Guard to distinguish themselves from the older, less organized, unorganized militia. 4. The Dick Act of 1903, the birth of the modern Guard. The disorganized state of the militias came to a head during the Spanish-American War in 1898, where state troops were mobilized but found to be completely unequipped to fight alongside the regular federal army. Secretary of War Ellen U. Root pushed for a massive overhaul, resulting in the Militia Act of 1903, commonly known as the Dick Act, named after its sponsor, Senator Charles Dick of Ohio, who was also a major general in the Ohio National Guard. The repeal. The Dick Act officially repealed the outdated Militia Act of 1792. The split. It formally divided the militia into 2 legal categories. The unorganized militia, also known as the reserve militia, consisting theoretically of all able-bodied males. The organized militia, officially titled the National Guard. Federalization. For the first time, the federal government agreed to provide weapons, equipment, and funding to the state National Guard units. In exchange, The state units had to adhere to federal training standards, organize their units identically to the regular U.S. Army, and attend federally funded summer training encampments. 5. The ideological legacy. Through subsequent legislation, specifically the National Defense Act of 1916 and the 1933 amendments, the National Guard was fully cemented as a permanent reserve component of the U.S. Army. However, the DNA of the 1775 state militias remains entirely intact. Just as the colonial politicians wanted in 1775, today's National Guard maintains its unique dual mission. When not mobilized for federal service by the president, National Guard units answer directly to their state governors, providing the localized, decentralized power to respond to state emergencies, natural disasters, and civil unrest. Primary and secondary sourcing for this outline. Primary documents: U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the Militia Act of 1792, 1 Stat 271, the Militia Act of 1903/the Dick Act, 32 Stat 775. Historiography: Civilian in Peace, Soldier in War, the Army National Guard, 1636 to 2000 by Michael D. Doubler. The definitive institutional history of the Guard's evolution from the colonial era. The Minutemen and Their World by Robert A. Gross, for the foundational culture of the early militias. Ellen U. Root and the Conservative Tradition by Richard W. Leopold, for the political maneuvering that created the Dick Act. Now, back to the main topic, Captain, and for anyone following along. The regional divide, the New England problem. The idea that New England spoke for the continent is the exact opposite of reality in 1775. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and the southern colonies deeply distrusted New Englanders. The cultural clash. New Englanders were largely Congregationalists, Puritans, with a highly egalitarian, democratic society based on town meetings. Southern and middle colony delegates were largely wealthy Anglicans and Quakers who viewed the New Englanders as rowdy, dangerous radicals, often using the derogatory term levelers, meaning people who wanted to level all social classes. The fear of a New England empire. In 1774 and 1775, many Southern planters and New York merchants feared that if they helped Massachusetts defeat the British, a radical, militarized New England would simply turn around and conquer the rest of the colonies. The political solution: putting Virginians in charge. The New England delegates, particularly John Adams and Samuel Adams, were acutely aware of how much the rest of the continent disliked them. They realized that if the war remained a Massachusetts problem, they would be crushed by the British. To build a continental accord, New England deliberately stepped back and pushed Virginians to the forefront. This was a calculated, brilliant political strategy to bind the wealthiest, most populous, and most aristocratic colony to their radical cause. The commander, as mentioned, John Adams nominated George Washington of Virginia to command the New England Army, explicitly to appease the South. The authorship. When it came time to write the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, and later the Declaration of Independence, New Englanders stepped aside to let Thomas Jefferson of Virginia be the primary draftsman. The presidency. Congress elected Peyton Randolph of Virginia as the first president of the Continental Congress. Primary and secondary sourcing for this outline. Primary documents. The Journals of the Continental Congress. Specifically June 1775 for the establishment of the Army, and June 1776 for the Board of War. The diary and autobiography of John Adams, in which he explicitly details his political maneuvering to get Washington appointed to overcome regional prejudices. Washington's letters to the President of Congress, chronicling his endless struggles with the militia system. Historiography. The Beginnings of National Politics by Jack N. Rakove, for the Mechanics of the Requisition System and the Board of War. Washington's Crossing by David Hackett Fisher, for the deep cultural divisions between the various state militias and the Continental Regulars. The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecote. The Push for Independence, 1776. Throughout early 1776, public opinion shifted rapidly, heavily influenced by the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the realization that Britain was hiring Hessian mercenaries to crush the rebellion. The Lee Resolution, June 7, 1776, Virginia Delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Committee of Five, while delaying the vote on Lee's resolution to allow delegates to consult their home assemblies, Congress appointed a committee: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, to draft a formal declaration. The vote: Congress approved the Lee Resolution on July 2nd, 1776. The actual day independence was legally declared. They debated and revised Jefferson's draft for 2 days, officially adopting the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776.
What can you provide me on the Committee of Five? Who were they, and how did they end up on that committee?
I can certainly break that down for you, Captain. The formation of the Committee of Five is a masterclass in the delicate, highly calculated political balancing act that defined the Continental Congress. They were not simply the 5 best writers in the room. They were a meticulously curated cross-section of the continent, designed to ensure that if the Declaration of Independence was drafted, it would have the political backing of every major faction and region. Here is the deep dive into exactly who they were, why they were chosen, and how they ended up with the most famous writing assignment in American history. The catalyst: buying time, June 11th, 1776. To understand how they were chosen, we must understand why the committee was formed. On June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced his resolution for independence. However, several delegations, particularly New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, were strictly bound by their home legislatures not to vote for independence. Congress realized that forcing a vote immediately would shatter the fragile Continental Union. Therefore, they voted to delay the final decision until early July to give delegates time to send express riders home and get their instructions changed. In the meantime, just in case the vote passed, Congress appointed a committee on June 11th to prepare a formal declaration. Congress operated by electing committee members via ballot. The resulting 5 men represented a flawless geographical and ideological spread. 1. Thomas Jefferson, Virginia the pen and the political anchor. At 33, Jefferson was one of the youngest delegates. He was not a vocal debater on the floor of Congress, but he had brought a massive reputation with him as a political philosopher and writer, largely due to his 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. Why he was chosen? Politically, the radical New Englanders knew that a Virginian had to be the face of independence to keep the wealthy Southern planters engaged in the war. How he became the draftsman? The committee originally pushed the task of drafting the document onto John Adams. According to Adams's own later recollections, he refused and explicitly nominated Jefferson, citing 3 reasons. First, a Virginian ought to appear at the head of the business. Second, Adams acknowledged he was himself too obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular among the moderate delegates. And third, Adams conceded that Jefferson possessed a peculiar felicity of expression that Adams lacked. 2. John Adams, Massachusetts, the engine of independence. If Jefferson was the pen, John Adams was the engine. He was the undisputed floor leader of the radical faction and the loudest, most persistent voice for a total break from Great Britain. Why he was chosen? As the primary instigator of the independence movement, it was impossible to exclude him. He represented the radical vanguard of New England that had been fighting the British military for over a year. He was essentially the project manager of the committee, ensuring the document maintained a firm, uncompromising legal foundation while pushing it through the brutal editing debates on the floor of Congress. 3. Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania the sage and the editor. At 70 years old, Franklin was the oldest delegate in Congress and arguably the most famous American in the world. Why he was chosen. Prestige. Franklin brought unparalleled international credibility to the committee. He represented the middle colonies and the intellectual heft of the Enlightenment. His role: Franklin was suffering from severe gout during the drafting process and was largely confined to his lodgings. He declined to write the first draft, telling Jefferson that he made it a rule to avoid becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body. However, he served as Jefferson's primary editor. The most famous edit in American history belongs to Franklin, where Jefferson originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin crossed it out and wrote the far more secular, Enlightenment-grounded phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." 4. Roger Sherman, Connecticut the Practical Statesman. Roger Sherman is one of the most underrated founding fathers. A former shoemaker who became a self-taught lawyer and judge, he was notoriously unpolished but possessed a razor-sharp legal mind. He is the only person to sign all 4 great state papers of the U.S., the Continental Association, the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Why he was chosen. Sherman represented the conservative, pragmatic wing of New England. While Adams was viewed as a radical firebrand, Sherman was universally respected by the moderate and conservative delegates as a man of solid, unshakable common sense. His presence on the committee assured the cautious delegates that the resulting document would not be a wildly radical manifesto, but a reasoned legal argument. 5. Robert Livingston, New York the political pawn. Livingston was a phenomenally wealthy aristocratic landowner from New York. He was also deeply hesitant about independence. Why he was chosen. His appointment was a brilliant piece of political manipulation by the radical faction. New York's delegation was abstaining from the independence vote because their provincial Congress had not authorized them to break from Britain. By putting Livingston on the drafting committee, Congress was actively forcing New York to participate in the mechanics of independence, hoping to drag the reluctant colony over the finish line. The irony, the tactic did not entirely work in the short term. When it came time to actually sign the Declaration, Livingston had been recalled to New York to help draft their state constitution. He never actually signed the document he technically helped commission. Primary and secondary sourcing for this outline. Primary documents: the Journals of the Continental Congress, June 11th, 1776. For the committee appointments, the letters of John Adams to Timothy Pickering, August 1822, where Adams details the exact conversation of why he forced Jefferson to write the draft. Thomas Jefferson's notes of proceedings in the Continental Congress. Historiography, American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence by Pauline Maier, the absolute gold standard for the drafting process and committee dynamics, the Declaration of Independence. A study in the history of political ideas by Carl Becker, John Adams by David McCullough, for the deep personal dynamic between Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson during the summer of 1776.
Nice job, Helldiver. The one takeaway from this week that I have is that America was never about being on one accord. That for as long as this land has been called America, the world can be vastly different depending on how far north or south you may find yourself. Managing the diverse needs of such a populace was always a near impossible task, starting with 13 colonies all the way up to 50 states. Over the course of the oncoming weeks, we're to hopefully understand everything that's been done to that end through the lens of the evolution of Congress. Context is important, and in a literal sense, context is how all these events throughout history are connected. It may not feel like going back this far will provide actionable intel, but information without context can be demoralizing. And I want you to feel mission prepared, Helldivers. If there is anything we're covering this that you feel needs more explanation, please feel free to leave a comment. Our republic is complex, and I could have picked a number of entry points to understand it further. I just picked Congress because I needed to begin. After Congress, I'll move on to another branch of government and start from its beginnings. For now, though, we have part 3 of this current series next Friday. For Super Earth, for Real Earth, for all of us.